It's 10:30 p.m. on Sunday night, and I'm sitting down to watch Jordan Peterson versus 20 Atheists on Jubilee. And this one is especially interesting to me because I was invited to be on this particular episode, and I am kicking myself that I could not make it work. I would have loved to sit down and speak about atheism with Jordan Peterson, but we're going to settle for watching it. I'm not sure how I'm going to structure this video. We might just watch the whole thing and reply as we go, so buckle up for a long video, or maybe it won't end up like that and I'm just going to take some segments. We shall see. But I haven't seen anything of this. We're going to be watching it fresh together for the first time, starting with his claim number 1. Let's get to it.
My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Good afternoon, Dr. Peterson.
How are you doing?
So this claim here that atheists don't know what they're rejecting. My background is in studying to become a traditional Catholic priest, daily mass, daily rosary, going on long retreats, deep into the magisterium and biblical hermeneutics, like I was thoroughly in it. And it seems like I do know what I'm missing. Is there something that I missed over years of study, both this issue formally and living out religion so deeply?
Well, you obviously feel that you missed something when you were practicing for the priesthood. Your aim was off then. So there's always the possibility that it's still off now.
What was off about my aim in the first place?
I don't know. That might take a long time to figure out. But
then it seems kind of like this no true Scotsman type of fallacy in which you're the arbiter of people's aims and how they understand those aims to be. How is it that you can claim that people don't know something that you know about their life despite not having met them?
Well, it's obviously a generic claim, just like the atheist claim that there's no God is a generic claim. In your case, it would have to be specified more, and I'm not claiming to understand what was going on in your mind, but my experience with atheists is twofold, is that they have a very reductive notion of what constitutes God, let's say in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they've often been hurt by someone who was religious or by the religious enterprise, or perhaps by God himself, so to speak, and that's left them with an animus.
But I think that you have a reductive view of what atheism is. You've defined religion so broadly to include any sort of having aim in life, any sort of cultural archetypes, or having a metaphorical substrate. And atheism to you is a very specific type of like 3 people in the world that are these Raskolnikov type of, they want to get away with a perfect murder. It seems like you have the reductive view of what an atheist is.
Well, let's start with your claim. How do you define the God that you're rejecting? Like, what is God to you? You studied in the church, you found that unsatisfactory. How would you characterize what you rejected?
I think the average Christian believer, when they say that they're Christian and they believe, they mean some sort of God that is all-powerful, all-perfect, is somehow involved in the matters of this world, and that we look to them through wisdom and with the Logos incarnate in Christ. And it also seems like you don't believe in religion in the way that the average Christian says that they believe in religion. And there are as many gods out there as there are believers because everybody has mutually exclusive and different views of what God is. So it seems like...
Well, if everybody had mutually exclusive views of what God is, no one could speak to each other. The mere fact of communication presumes a commonality of assumption and definition. And it's certainly not the case that I regard any archetypal manifestation whatsoever as equally religious. So that's not a real claim. Let me give you an example. For example, there's a sub-narrative in the story of Moses where Moses is rewarded with a glimpse of God. Okay, and that's one of the ways that God is characterized in the Old Testament stories.
Yes.
Now, Moses is a faithful servant of God and a good man. At least that's the case within the confines of the story.
One possible interpretation.
It's the case within the confines of the story, obviously.
Not obviously. When we look at the Bible can't precisely say anything because there are so many different exegetical and hermeneutic views of this particular book, and that everybody has everybody has disagreed historically on, it seems like, even the most benign detail about a book this big. And it seems like you can only say that the Bible says something if you first presuppose that it's univocal.
So your claim essentially is that Moses in the Old Testament plays the role of a villain or is irrelevant? Because the alternative claim is that he's good.
I'm saying that we can't know, because we can't talk to those authors.
If you are going to start with the presupposition that there's nothing I can say about any of these stories that you're not going to disagree with from the perspective that there are multiple potential competing claims, then I can't speak with you. So
and we also have a short time here, so I want to get to the core of what you're arguing here, and I'd love if we could
The core of what I'm arguing is that atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting. So I'm trying to give you an example of what's being rejected and its complexity. Okay, so God rewards Moses with a glimpse of the divine. So this is a definition of the God that atheists are hypothetically rejecting.
A possible one.
I said I didn't say the. I said
That is possible, yes.
Okay. So despite the fact that Moses is a stellar character and he's had a long and difficult life and can withstand a lot of difficulty and travail, God puts him between two cliffs. So he can just see a crack of what's in front of him. And when God walks by, he allows him to see his back. Okay, so the implication of that story is that the divine is fundamentally unknowable. It's a pinnacle experience, and that people in their finitude have to be shielded from a comprehensive vision of the basis of reality. Well, that's not the God that's defined in that manner, right? It's not a simple personification. It's not a simple old man in the sky. It's something that in its essence is unknowable and overwhelming. And that isn't, in my experience, the God that's defined by atheists who are attempting to undermine the story. I mean, it's the same claim, for example, that you're a finite creature and that you face something that in the final analysis is unknowable, and that you have to establish a relationship with it regardless of your inability to perceive or even withstand perceiving the whole. Okay, is there a problem with that?
I mean, the problem is that when we look at, famously, when you've been asked, do you believe in God, the question becomes, what do we mean by God? And in the Bible, it's not even clear the biblical authors know what God is, because Yahweh has historically emerged from an early storm god, a deity that doesn't exhaust the category of deity, and that has changed over the Old Testament. Does God have physicality? Does God not have physicality? It seems like, yes, if you define religion to mean anybody that has an aim, anybody that looks at the unknown, anybody who wants to go from chaos to order is inherently religious, then yes. But also in the same way, I could define atheist as somebody who doesn't dogmatically believe in a religion, or somebody who doesn't regularly attend religious services or belong to a denomination. Help, especially the audience, kind of like boil this down. There was a lot of words there. That the central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
A central claim.
A central claim is that we exist somewhere between the finite and the infinite.
No, I said that we were finite and we had to establish a relationship with the infinite.
Yeah, then in that case, then we're all religious, but then I can do the same thing and define one particular element of atheism. It seems like we both have a reductive view of what the other side looks like, to the point where a conversation seems incoherent, and not just incoherent, but not in the way that the average Christian understands Christianity to be.
Do you have a problem
let's
with...
pause there. Sorry, you've been voted out by the majority.
That was a rough start. And you know what? I kind of blame Jubilee for not setting some better definitions here. I think a lot went wrong right away that could have been avoided. Can we get a working definition of atheism that everyone in the room kind of agrees on, at least a little bit? Can we get a definition of what God we're talking about? The way it was framed to me in the email is that this was going to be one Christian versus a group of atheists, as an exact inverse was the word that was used in the email to Alex O'Connor versus 20 Christians. But here, Jordan Peterson starts a little more abstractly. Of course, when he needs an example, he goes right to Yahweh. But when it suits him, we're bigger out here. Like, you've got to believe in the finite getting to negotiate with the infinite, or however he put it. It's so difficult to have a productive conversation, which should be the goal here, if we're going to be in and out with definitions, and also if we're going to let Jordan Peterson's claims misuse terminology in general. Again, claim one, just to say it very clearly, I want to get the words exactly right, is atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they are rejecting. Atheists are not rejecting God. That would be an admittance that God is there and we don't like him. We may not like the fictional character that is represented, or do not like what he would stand for in an internal critique, but an atheist by definition isn't rejecting God. They don't believe in God. You can't reject something that you don't believe in. I know it's trite, but I don't reject the tooth fairy. I just am not convinced the tooth fairy is real. So they're letting Jordan get away with something here that I think is already going to make the conversation almost impossible to have, because of course his stance, and we know this from his book and his claim to want to destroy atheism, even though at the same time he doesn't think any atheist actually exist, which is ridiculous on its own, but we know that he already feels that an atheist is someone who is rejecting God. But I would have pushed back on that first. If I was the first person to get to the chair, which I hate that setup, that's exactly what I would have done. I would say, whoa, before we get into this, let's talk about this word rejecting. But also a hard conversation to have if you're not talking about a certain God, because what this guy said, and I really like that guy, I don't know him, I apologize, is that there are so many gods, and that this is a very hard conversation to have if you can jump around from different God to different God, and everyone has a different idea of God, to which Jordan says not everyone can have a mutually exclusive. Yeah, but like you understand what he's saying, right? Even within Christianity, how many thousands of denominations, and then even within the denominations, you get to people's personal opinions and views and how they interact with God, etc. Like, yes, of course, this is absolute insanity. And I want to be really open here. Like, if Jordan Peterson has great points, if he's got good questions, if he's got good stances, I'm going to say it, even though all of you who seem to watch my channel hate this man. I have no problem with calling out the atheist here or complimenting Jordan. But how he started, I thought, man, he just doesn't have the temperament for this. He's already short-fused. He doesn't do well on a time limit. He's starting to get into his lecture mode here. He's getting sarcastic and facetious with just the littlest bit of pushback. This, I fear, could be a long night. Here we go. But by the way, like seriously, that guy did great. He knew what Jordan Peterson's stance was. He knew where it was going to get lost. He tried to bring him in. He just didn't get there.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you,
David.
David, good to see you.
Tell me everything that you know about the Polynesian deity Lono, L-O-N-O.
I don't know anything about the Polynesian deity Lono.
So you're rejecting something without knowledge of what you're rejecting.
I'm not rejecting it. No more than I'm rejecting
do you believe
anything
in Lono?
that I don't know anything about.
Do you believe in Lono?
I
Do you
fail to
believe
see
that
the
he is a
relevance of
deity
that.
that exists in the world, exists in the universe, that exists in the existence of everything? Do you believe that Lono
I'll
is
answer
a
that
being?
question once you answer my question, which is, do I reject everything that I'm ignorant of? Because that's your presupposition that undergirds your argument, and unless you can prove that that's valid, then there's no point in...
My question is quite simple.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's formulated accurately.
Do you believe that Lono exists? Yes or no?
I'm not going to answer that question for the reasons I just described. You already insisted that if I reject something, that if I'm ignorant of something, I reject it. Do you think that everyone in the world has to know everything simultaneously for that to be valid and true?
I think in order for your
Answer that
argument
question.
to be true, in order for it to be true that we atheists don't understand what we're rejecting, then you need to also apply that to yourself and to Christians and to Muslims and to any other person on this earth, where if you don't understand what you're rejecting the belief in, then you can't reject the belief in it. That's the implication of your claim.
I didn't say that I rejected the belief in Lona.
Oh, this is so frustrating. I mean, it's a perfect example because Jordan Peterson is accusing him of doing the very thing that Jordan Peterson's question does at the beginning. And this man found a smart way to articulate it back to Jordan Peterson by way of example. And JP must know this because he's refusing to answer it. And he's standing on some kind of ground that it's not formulated correctly. And first he must prove this and this. No, it is such a simple comparison. You are saying that the atheist rejects God and that they don't know what they're rejecting. And here you have a chance, Jordan Peterson, to see the other side of the coin, and you either refuse to see it or you can't see it. And I don't know what's worse.
I didn't say anything about rejecting.
That's because I've asked you several times and you haven't, but let me get to my even greater point. Mm-hmm. You're saying atheists don't understand what religion is or what God is in order to be able to reject it fully or completely. We have someone over here who studied it in their own way. I've studied religion. I have a degree in religious studies, specialty in Christianity and Mediterranean traditions. And further than that, beyond me, Pew Research studies suggest that atheists and agnostics actually know more about religion and about religious stories, the foundational principles, than believers.
That's because they're more religious than they think they are.
Okay, you can...
They're concerned with deep matters, and one of the defining characteristics of someone who's oriented in a religious direction is that they're concerned with deep matters.
This is why it'd be hard to have a conversation with Jordan, and what would get me in trouble is I would say, stop, let's back up, okay? I just gave you data that it is atheists and agnostics that know more about religion on average than the proponents of that religion, to which you agreed. Then you said the reason you agree is because they're actually quite religious. Then you give a definition that it's religious people who are concerned with deep matters. But no, right? That can't both be true. If the religious person was actually concerned with deep matters, they would be seeking out more information about the religion, which is what you just agreed isn't happening. So instead of trying to get some lobbed up point about how atheists are actually kind of religious, maybe just listen to the question that this guy is presenting instead of being completely self-defeating.
Right, but they also have to identify with a religious tradition and accept the foundational stories that go along with that.
Well, that would mean more that they're sectarian than that they're religious. And most people, for example, in the United States, deny that they're religious, but accept that they're spiritual.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
Bummer. I mean, we'll move on to the next person, but one of the things I hate about this, and maybe it should be a smaller group like 5 or 10, is there's so many people there. They all want their chance to talk. They've all flown a long way. I get it. No hurt on them. But you'll see people like nodding along like, yeah, I like where this is going, but they have their flag up. It's like, then let the guy get to the point. He's building an argument here. I get voting someone out if they're just like doing horribly here, but I liked the trajectory of that conversation, and I would like to see him continue to press Jordan Peterson on the hypocrisy of his initial claim here. But that's just not how the show works.
Good, how
What's
are you?
your name?
I'm Greg. Nice to meet you.
Greg.
Okay, so I feel like you're getting at this idea of polysemy, where we have multiple related meanings for a word, right? Like, for example, a famous painting can be emotionally moving in that it changes my emotional state. And when I was on the highway coming here to the studio, I was physically moving. I was changing my position. If I said, I believe the Mona Lisa is very moving, and you said, you don't really understand what you're saying, it's nailed to the wall, I would say that you're the one who doesn't understand what I'm saying, not the other way around. And the way that relates to this is there are many concepts of God, and I'll admit, I find a lot of what you say about that interesting. I'm familiar with it. The idea of this kind of Jungian hierarchical thing, or as a metaphor or a symbol, or the kind of, atheist, materialist, literalist idea of a agentic, omnipotent, omniscient being that intervenes in reality, right? So when I'm saying that I reject the concept of God, I'm aware of these other definitions of God, but I think that when we use words, we tend to only imply one meaning at a time. So the same way that I would say the Mona Lisa is moving emotionally, but I would not say it's moving physically. I would say I reject the concept of God in this very literal way. But
What literal way?
the way that God is this omniscient, omnipotent, agentic, supernatural being that sent his son down and has, caused miracles and all these things like that. The idea of God is
Do you think that there's an underlying unity of things?
Could you explain that question?
I'm going to cut him off here. I like this in general. I think this is a good approach. Also, it's funny. I don't know if he's trying to be funny. In Jordan Peterson's newest book, We Who Wrestle with God, in chapter 1, Jordan Peterson just does one of his little, I call them JP leaps, where he talks about the verse in Genesis, how the Spirit moves upon the face of the water. And he ties that into the idea of being moved, as if the Hebrew word for moving also has that interplay on it. It's just ridiculous, and it's a perfect example of his semantic games, which is what we are seeing here. He even questions, what do you mean by literal? What this guy gives a good answer for. He also drums down into the Christian God. So can we just call a spade and talk about Christianity, or are we not doing that? Also, I don't like that no one has pushed back on saying it's not that we reject God, it's that we don't believe in him. But again, everyone has their talking point they're ready to do. And so maybe they don't want to get caught up in new things. But let's see where this goes.
Well, scientists, for example, believe that science unifies in a comprehensive theory. Do you, yes, no, or that there are multiple competing truths? Those are the options. Either things unify, or there are multiple competing truths.
I know that, for example, like in physics, people are looking for like a theory of everything.
And why do you think they're doing that?
It's interesting, it's helpful.
But they also believe that there's an underlying unity to things.
In a sense, yeah, like the material world and time and space are probably governed by universal laws and principles.
Partly that, yes, yes, but that the same thing might extend to a broader domain that would include imagination and value.
Could you help me connect that to the prompt?
Well, I'm trying to define God, the God
Yeah.
that I don't think atheists do a very good job of defining. Here's another question for you. What do you think guides you in your determination of whether or not what you're saying to me is true?
Can we go back? Can we stay on what we were talking about?
We are.
Okay.
You're just uncomfortable with the question.
No, I feel like you're just kind of throwing different spaghetti at the wall.
I'm not.
Okay.
I asked
All right.
you a very specific question. What is it that you think guides you when you're talking to me to help you determine whether what you say is true?
Logic, memory, reasoning, sensory information.
How do you distinguish that from being governed by something that's false?
An interesting question.
How do you know the difference when you speak between what's true and what's false? So you could
I
imagine
infer, right? I can infer. I can.
from what principles?
So, and what are you getting at?
I'm getting at the fact that your conscience guides you. Is that
Okay.
reasonable?
Conscious is defined by
Conscience.
my empathy and my reason, or my foundational.
Define it any way you want.
Okay, so that's how I'm defining my conscience. Is my my conscience is my sense of
Right
and
and
wrong. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
Where
yeah.
does that come from?
I would say that comes from an evolved capacity to empathize and a recognition of the benefits of engaging with and nurturing that capacity. And then that empathy is constrained and guided by reason, right? Like, for example, I am driving down the highway, there's a kitten in the road. I'm going to empathetically feel, oh my God, I want to save the kitten, but then reasonably, like I'm going to get hit by a car, right? So that's sort of the process through which I make ethical decisions.
Okay,
Is
how do
empathy
you-
constrained by reason?
Do you think that people can differ in their response to something empathically?
Yeah, like,
Is there a mediating principle that can tell you one person who's empathic and another person who's empathic that disagree, who's correct?
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we'd have to, talk it out, right?
Mm-hmm.
We do that in real life all the time when we have, whether that's a discussion with a friend about the right thing to do in a situation, whether that's a policy discussion about law, right? That's where we can converse with each other, think about things, explain our perspectives, and then kind of reach a conclusion, right? That I think that we do that all the time.
So Elijah, the prophet Elijah, defined God in the Old Testament as the voice of conscience within.
Okay.
That's a definition.
So you're saying by that definition of God, I guess, see, this kind of goes back to what I'm saying initially.
I'm not defining it. Elijah
Okay,
defined
so
it.
as Elijah defines
It's
God.
defined that way in Jonah, too.
Okay, so as
Cardinal Newman also
got
defined it that
as,
way.
as I'm sure you know many people who've defined it that way, and it's impressive. You're a very knowledgeable person.
I'm not trying to be impressive. I'm
okay.
just pointing out to you
Got
how
it.
God is defined in the Old
Okay.
Testament.
All right.
I know Jordan Peterson can have better conversations. I've seen him be good faith. This is ridiculous. How many questions has this young man answered? And how many has Jordan Peterson answered? Do you know how many different definitions of God are anywhere in the Protestant canon, just for starters? Heck, let's just stay in the Old Testament with Jordan Peterson. I've heard Jordan Peterson use other examples from the Old Testament to define God. Are we arguing here about if there's a supernatural element to our conscience? Or was the claim that should be the topic of discussion where this young man started was that atheists reject God, but they don't know what they're rejecting? And if he wants to make that point, just say that. Hey, I made this claim, and what I actually mean by it is I think you have a lot of things working in your life for you, like ethics and morality and your conscience, whatever you want to define them as, but I think there's a deeper level to all of that. We'll even call it supernatural. And I think when you reject the concept of God at large, you're rejecting the idea that those things are grounded out there. And so that's one of my claims, and I want to hear your thoughts on that. But instead, we have to go like it's a podcast and they have 2 hours to delve into every little definition. It's insane. Again, I just don't think he's suited for this kind of discussion. And this guy is so sweet. He's just trying to answer the questions. He's being thoughtful. These are huge questions, and they don't necessarily need to be articulated in this format in a timely manner for them to naturally move the conversation forward based off what the prompt is. Man, I would just keep pushing back on that. Good luck, buddy.
So to respond to that, I do think there are lots of interesting ways to define God. And that goes back to my kind of opening
Then how do we
statement.
specify what we're arguing about?
We use context clues, or again, it goes back to my example of the Mona
I'm defining
Lisa.
God as conscience.
Okay, so that's interesting, but then you're kind of expanding the meaning of
No,
God.
I'm not. That's how it's defined in the Old Testament.
Okay,
in
so-
Elijah and in Jonah.
Sure. So whoever. So some.
It's not whoever.
Okay.
Elijah is one of the
Okay.
major
All right.
Old Testament
All right.
prophets,
All
right?
right.
He's equal in stature to Moses.
Okay.
Right. So it's not arbitrary.
All right. So that is interesting, but it's not relevant to the context with which I am using the term God.
It's directly relevant. Atheists reject God, but they don't
Right, but
understand what they're rejecting.
you're
You
being-
accept conscience as a guide, and conscience is one of the defining characteristics of God in the Old Testament.
I think you're being intellectually disingenuous
In what way?
because again,
I asked you if you
hey,
believe that conscience guided you.
You just asked me a question and then you stopped me from answering it. In this setting, you understand the way I am using the term God and belief.
Not
and
in
then
the least. I don't understand how you're using it in the least. That's why I'm trying to define it. My definition of God as conscience is a lot more precise and oriented than your definition of the God that you hypothetically disbelieve in.
It's irrelevant to the fault lines of this debate.
How is it irrelevant?
Because in common parlance, when we're talking about atheists, God, belief, not belief,
I
we're
don't
not
care
talking
about common parlance. I'm trying to get to something fundamental.
That's such a stupid statement. We don't know because he hasn't allowed this young man to speak. And he hasn't asked him about the God he supposedly rejects. He started with all these abstract things about what guides you towards a truthful conversation. And then when he latches on to something that approximates something like conscience, he says, yep, that's it. And here's a definition, one definition of many in one religion of many. So again, if you're arguing from the Christian perspective, can we just establish that? This guy's right. He was being disingenuous. And this is why you need to start with definitions long before this starts. But also, I would stop the whole thing right here. And I would just say, okay, stop. You define God as conscience. That's what you just said. Is that it? Or is there more? Does your God have a name? You're using the Hebrew God for your examples. Do you believe in that God as he's displayed in all ways, not just by Jonah and Elijah? Because that God is also claimed to be the creator of everything. He's also claimed to be the beginning and the end. Also the arbiter of morality and salvation, eternal life, etc. A specific God with a specific name, with a specific chosen group of people who did specific acts in specific areas on specific dates. Do you believe that? Because that's the God I don't believe in, and I can tell you why I don't believe in it. But if your only definition is God as conscience, then we simply disagree about what that is and the basis for it. But that's not what's really going on here.
I think your point is irrelevant to the way that people
Which
tend to use
point?
these words. Your point that there are these polysemous
I didn't make
ideas
that
of
point.
God.
You did.
I
made a specific
characterized
point
it,
that God
right.
was associated with conscience.
I just feel like you kind of retreat into this semantic fog.
I'm not retreating at all. I'm advancing, sir. You are retreating.
All right. Well, it was very nice to meet you.
Nice
I appreciate
to meet
the
you too.
conversation.
Yeah. It's very brave of you to do this.
Thank you.
Maybe I'm already on a bad angle with JP here, but saying something like it's very brave of you to do this when they're both doing the same thing seems highly condescending. No? Like I just can't imagine saying that to someone in that context after having just told them they're retreating and all of that. Like it's not honest. But anyways, that was claim 1. We had 4 people speak, and unfortunately, we didn't talk about rejecting God versus not believing in God. And we didn't get Jordan to say what he thinks they're not understanding. This is what I mean. I just don't know how good the Jubilee setup is for actually getting anywhere. Like almost none of that had anything to do or arrived anywhere close to ending up with a conversation about claim number 1. Let's see if claim 2 goes better.
My next claim is that morality and purpose cannot be found within science.
What is up, Mr. Canada?
How you doing, man?
I'm doing great.
What's
How are
your
you?
name?
Brian. I think it's interesting that you say that morality and purpose can't be found in science. Actually,
No, within science.
sure. Purpose, I actually grant you, because purpose is subjective, right? Unless you want to boil it down to the purpose of life is just to procreate, right? Sure, whatever. Morality is actually something that we do see. We actually have examples of Neanderthals, an older individual was found in a tribe, missing an arm, missing teeth, still alive somehow in his 40s, 50s, right? Typically, you're a Neanderthal, you can't eat, you can't hunt, you die, right? But we know that members of his tribe were taking care of him, right? So we know that at some level, early in our evolutionary history, we actually developed altruism. We have examples of chimpanzees who actually have a basic understanding of fairness, right? If you give a chimpanzee 2 grapes, right, and his buddy gets 3, right? He actually freaks out, right? But you give both chimps 3 grapes and they're good. We have examples of parrots.
Except for the greedy chimps.
Except for the greedy chimps.
They want 4 grapes.
They want 4 grapes. You know, those do exist, right? But we have similar examples where we do animal tests, right?
So morality is intrinsic.
I think.
So it precedes science.
I think that actually a better way to define it would be that social animals, which we are, right, require some level of morality or...
Into what? I'm not disagreeing.
Sure.
Why do they require that?
Because it's the only way that social groups can actually survive, right?
That's my point with regards to science. Thank you very much.
Is that?
Precisely the point that you just made, that science has to exist within a moral framework that isn't in itself scientific.
How's that not scientific?
Well, because it's not derived from the scientific process, as you just indicated.
It doesn't need to derive from the scientific process. It's the fact that we are social animals, and we need that to exist as a group.
I agree,
right?
but you pointed to the morality of Neanderthals, to the morality of chimpanzees. They didn't derive that from science.
They don't need to. That's not how that works.
That's my point.
Science explains it. So
No, science doesn't explain morality.
It doesn't explain how social animals would need to be.
Well, that's a complicated question.
But we see it though.
Yeah, but explaining the evolution of morality and explaining morality itself aren't the same thing.
Okay, so you're asking why does this happen?
Yes, that's more accurate.
Because we're social animals and we need to be.
Yeah, but there's more to it than that.
Is there?
Sure. For example, so we're moral animals that have a sense of the future.
Sure.
Okay, that makes us unique. And that structures our morality.
No, actually, there are other animals that can predict the future. Or not
Not
predict
really.
the future. No, tigers. Actually, there was a tiger at the SF Zoo that killed somebody. And so
Hunting
actually,
animals.
No. Kids threw shit at the tiger. The tiger actually plotted its escape, and it found the kids.
I'm not saying that animals can't think.
Okay.
No, but they can
pause here.
perceive the future. That's what I'm saying.
Well-
Voted out by the majority.
Thank you, man.
Good man. Yeah.
I kind of get why that got voted out. I think that they're not on point for what JP is actually trying to claim here, right? It seems clear to me in the claim that he wants to attach morality and purpose to something before or greater than science. I'm assuming God. And so if, going back to claim 1, atheist reject or do not believe in God, they don't know what they're rejecting, which is the very definition or idea of purpose and morality. I think, if I'm guessing correctly, is what JP is his overall point. So let's just get to that. I do appreciate how this guy tried to show that there's morality in other things that come before biblical stories and in other creatures. I wish he would have been able to define why that's important, because it shows a skill. It shows a evolved process that also would mean then it's not innate. It's not entirely natural. It's something that had to be gained and learned and taught and expanded and agreed upon along the way, and differently in different groups and within different species, which I think removes objectivity from it. And so if morality and then purpose or meaning are not objective, we don't have to try to, it's like a false dilemma here to say that you can't get it from science, because the question for an atheist is if you can have it at all, objective or subjectively, without a God. Clarity. We need definitions. We need to nail down what is trying to actually be claimed. That's what I want to see.
How you doing?
How you doing, man?
My name's Luke. Nice to meet
Good
you.
to see you, Luke.
So your claim that morality and purpose can only be found in science is a little shaky, because I think that your claim is really being framed to be morality and purpose can only be found in religion. Is that how you're kind of framing it?
I would say that the domain of religion is the domain of morality and purpose. Yes, exactly. And also that science is actually structured, at least in part technically, to eliminate such considerations from its purview a priori.
Okay.
Right? That's why we define science as value-free. But that has to be wrong, because scientists have to prioritize their attention towards something before they can even engage in observation.
Okay.
And that act of prioritization of attention is a value-predicated act. And so I can continue. There's all sorts of things we have to assume about science before it can take place.
Okay, so what I'm specifically pointing out here is about religion in particular, since you yourself are a Christian, right?
People debate about that, and I generally don't discuss it publicly.
Okay, I understand that. And me, myself, I am a former young earth creationist fundamentalist.
Oh, yeah.
So I have experience in this. I used to run a TikTok channel directed about apologetics about the Bible, specifically in this type of facet with morality, evolution and such, and going back and forth with that. So in the Bible, it talks a lot about slavery, right?
Yes.
Yes. So in that, it teaches you how to take care of a slave. Rather than saying slavery's wrong, I think
No,
it
it
should
says
say
that in the story of Moses.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says
Well,
it's immoral.
that's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
First of all, good on him for trying to narrow down here. But if you're going to bring up slavery with someone like Jordan Peterson, you've got to be ready. The answer right now, right here, should be no. All that proves is that one particular God disapproves of one particular kind of slavery, the one that's against his chosen people. We can turn right around and show the express permission given in Leviticus that follows right after the Exodus for how they are to own slaves. It's so unbelievably clear. Please, please, please answer this well.
But why does the Bible predicate and tell people exactly how to take care of a slave? Isn't
Well,
that immoral? Wouldn't you say that culturally we've evolved as a species, as he said earlier about empathy?
Yeah, I would say that the reason we evolved, so to speak, away from slavery was because the West was founded on Judeo-Christian morality and the presumption that every person was made in the image of God. And so slavery itself became immoral, and that was established by Protestant Christians in the UK, who then convinced the UK government for 200 years to go to war on slavery.
And wouldn't you say that this is about the cultural evolution of humans in general, rather than just Christianity?
No, I think it's the flowering of the ideas that were embedded in the biblical texts across long spans of time.
I feel like this is just humans editing based on the cultural evolution of
What do you mean
morality.
by just?
Just?
Yeah, just humans.
Well, humans.
Editing.
Well, based on culture and history, right? We get better.
Well, they did do it based on culture and history, but culture and history have their foundations too. So.
Well, yeah, but we're talking about slavery. So many people bolstered it based on the
Everyone
Bible. Based on the Bible. They looked at
much
it and
less
they
true.
justified it in the United States and the Deep South. They justified slavery
Yeah, but
based
the main
on the
thrust,
Bible.
the main thrust of Protestant thought in particular was stringently
Yes,
against slavery,
which-
and it was about the only movement in the history
Yes.
of the human race that
Yes.
had an anti-slavery direction.
Which was driven by humans and their
Well,
understanding
that's one
of
way of
morality.
looking at it. Well, it depends.
It's the same with women's suffrage. I mean, women's in the patriarchy.
What do you mean it was driven by humans? Humans
Humans.
drove slavery too.
Yes, exactly.
So there's no argument there. If slavery and anti-slavery were both driven by humans, what does your claim that they were driven by humans have to do with it?
evolving morality based on the culture that within the society that they live in.
Okay,
So
fine.
with
I think
women's
that did
suffrage as
happen.
well is a very similar topic in the Bible. There are denominations in Christianity, such as Pentecostal movement, which do bolster women to be pastors, right? Which I think that's a great thing to do. But most like to disregard
Where do you
women.
think the idea that human beings were sufficiently equal to all vote and not be slaves came from?
Humans.
Yeah, but so did the idea of slavery.
So did the
that's
idea of God.
Fine, but what's
Yes.
your point? Like, you're not making an argument. You're just saying all thoughts come from humans,
Yes.
regardless of the thoughts.
It's not driven by a higher power. It's driven on our experiences
Define
as
higher.
humans, which is what is best for all people.
Is it driven by conscience?
It could be. Which conscious is also something that has evolved over time, and I think that's
What's
something
the
that does evolve in morality and empathy.
Okay, I don't understand the point that you're making.
My point is that God influenced slavery. People looked at the Bible and went, "This is moral because God says so." Just like women's suffrage,
There's lots
and
of
just like homosexuality.
all human societies were slave owning, so you
Yes.
can't blame that on the Bible.
If humanity decided,
Oh wait, address that first.
What, about
All
slavery?
human societies were slavers, so you can't blame that on the Bible.
I understand why this is going nowhere, and this is redundant for me to keep chirping in, saying as much, but this is why there's got to be someone, man, I hope it happens, that just says, Jordan, hold on, slow down. Why are we even talking about your claim that morality cannot be found within science? You have atheists who disagree on that. They could all debate it. Clearly, you are bringing this up because you see them at odds, belief or Christianity or science, when it comes to morality. And I would get agreement from him if that is indeed what we're talking about. Because if that's what we're talking about, and if he has a specific God or an abstract God, again, are we just talking about God as conscience, or are we talking about a specific God? And if so, are we talking about Yahweh? You're using only Yahweh examples, so can we assume that even if you won't say publicly you're a Christian, this is the God? You're referencing Judeo-Christian values to make your argument here. Like, hone in on this, and then That's why I'm bringing this up. Yes, all societies, to answer your question, have utilized slavery and backed it up with their own particular philosophies and religions, and so does the Bible, which belongs to the religion of Yahweh. Therefore, if a God is supposed to be all powerful and all just and immutable, we shouldn't see that exact same thing. So it looks much more like morality is a skill that evolved over time. And yes, you can use a book for or against, but we have history of both here, which again suggests subjectivity. And again, I'm not saying I would have done perfect or these guys all suck. I'm not saying that at all. They're getting railroaded though by Jordan Peterson. And that's the other thing that I don't love about Jubilee is there's no moderation. There's no one saying, hey, hold on. He answered 9 of your questions. Answer 1 of his. Hey, hold on. You just changed the topic for the 14th time. Hey, can you stick to your claim? That's why we brought you here. But I have hope it's going to get better.
Well, you can say it bolstered it.
Well, not if you look at the broad sweep of history, because it was the Protestant Christians
based
in
on
the
their
UK.
interpretation of the Bible,
It was the Protestant Christians.
which evolves over time.
Let's pause there. You've been voted out by the majority.
All right. Well, it was great talking with you,
nice
sir.
talking to you, too.
Yes.
Dr. Peterson?
Good to see you, man.
Pleasure.
What's your name?
Brian. So the first thing I would like to say is I would like to engage in this discussion in a symbiotic manner. I would not like to engage where there is one clear winner and one clear loser. Emotions are activated and it ultimately comes about ego. So I'm just saying I'm really trying to understand your position, and I would just like you to really try to understand my position.
Deal.
Okay, sounds good. With that, if you're saying that morality and purpose cannot come from science, is the opposite of that true, that morality and purpose can only come from God?
Okay, there's hope. Here we go.
That's a way of defining it, yes.
Okay.
That's right, that's good. So I would say that with regard to the first claim, say, atheists don't understand what they're rejecting, because I would say by definition, God is the unity upon which moral claims are based. That's a definition, right?
Okay, if there is a God, what is the purpose of life?
Well, in the Christian tradition, the purpose of life is to engage in voluntary, upward, self-sacrifice so that the kingdom of heaven can be established on earth.
So you're trying to make it to heaven and avoid hell.
Yes, that's
Okay.
a good way of thinking about it.
What is the purpose of heaven? Do you understand? So here's the deal.
At minimum,
get
it's
into
the
an
opposite
infinite.
of endless suffering. How about that?
Okay, and so should we not try to achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth? And if we can achieve infinite suffering on planet Earth without God, avoiding it, if we can do that without God, then does that defeat your claim?
Well, yeah, except that it doesn't. You circumvented my initial definition, because I said that by definition, God was the unified source of morality. And so if we engage in a moral exercise...
And when you're talking about morality, though, when you really reverse engineer it and you get it down to its root, you're a psychologist, it really seems like it just has to deal with motivation. People are saying there is a God,
It's more specific than that.
Well, so let me ask you this. So if there is a God and there is a moral code and it doesn't come at your benefit, are you going to follow it?
It depends on how you define your benefit. If it's
going to come at your expense, would you still follow it?
Expense.
If God came down and said, here is my moral code and you should follow it, but even if you follow it, you are still going to end up in hell, are you going to follow it?
Well, that was the question that was put to Job and to Christ.
No, it wasn't. At no time did God come down and say, hey, there's an idea of eternity, of bliss and paradise, as opposed to one of infinite torment, and tell Job, follow all my rules, and I'm still going to send you to hell. Job only knew of Sheol. His suffering was altogether pretty darn temporary for what we're talking about. Yes, he may not have known the end, but he would have assumed his death would have ended it. This question is very straightforward. In fact, it's one I've posed on my channel a few times. How many Christians would there be who love God because he's perfect, because he's the creator, because you can't argue with the arbiter of all things if paradise didn't wait for them, if they were going to get the same end result as us heathens? And definitely this was not the case for Jesus. Jesus was God himself who knew the whole system and knew that no matter what happened on earth or on the cross or his day and a half under, that he would remain and return and be God, the supreme perfect being of everything forever. I'm cutting him off, so maybe it's going to get better, but I doubt it. And this should be interjected with immediately.
Because they were required hang on, I'm answering your question. They were required to withstand trials that would break anyone and maintain their upward orientation regardless.
And they did that with the motivation of believing that this omnipotent, all-loving God would somehow turn it into a benefit. So they still did it solely for their benefit. So
No,
when you,
not, well,
yes,
let's
they
define,
did. Yes,
hang
they
on,
did.
hang on. Let's define benefit. Like, if I did something for your sister, would that be to your benefit? Like, how are you defining your benefit? Do you mean one of your whims gratified now? Or do you mean you and everyone you love and know over some reasonable span of time? Like,
so
what do you mean by you?
when you're talking about whims, I think you're talking about something that's more dopamine. When you're talking about morality, you're talking about something that's more serotonin and more ultimately satisfying. So you and I agree on a lot. I mean, when it comes to talking about how men should be masculine and things of that nature, you and I are 100% in agreement. We just don't agree on the justification that God is the only thing that provides morality.
It's not a justification, it's a definition.
What's the difference then between a definition and a justification? I mean, it's ultimately psychologically the same thing.
Well, we have to define what we're talking about before we can debate.
Okay, well,
right?
so here's my position.
So I said that God, among other things.
I'm actually a non-theist. I'm not an atheist. I believe the human condition is one of uncertainty. And what that means is that I don't believe that you can conclude there is a God with certainty, and I don't believe that you can conclude that there is a God without in the same position. Now, with that, I don't care. I still wake up every day, and I have motivation to be a moral person.
Define moral.
Moral, what I ought to do.
Okay, and how do you come to that conclusion?
And what I ought to do, ultimately it comes down to what not just benefits me, but what benefits the entire planet, what benefits the entire system. I think that your entire moral perspective comes from linear thinking. And when you look at the reality of the universe, it's actually more so holistic. So when you look at how Aristotle defined God, when he said that there had to be an unmoved moved or an uncaused cause, he was defining God from a linear perspective. And you do the same with morality, and you do the same with purpose.
How does my definition of morality? How does my definition of morality hypothetically differ from yours?
Because you're saying that there's something that exists in a vacuum, that it exists in and of itself, and nothing in the universe exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists in and of itself. It's a whole systems-based morality. It's a systems-based reality.
Is there a hierarchical structure?
What the quantum.
Is there a hierarchical structure? Are some things more important than others?
Are some things, I think some things lead to more benefits than others.
Then, by your own definition, some things are more important than others.
Yes.
Okay.
What is pause there? You've been voted out by the majority.
Okay. We climbed up a rung. Even to see Jordan Peterson wish that the conversation could have kept going was nice. But you heard Jordan Peterson say we need to narrow down on definitions here. Then do that. What is morality? What exactly is God? Is it just conscience or something else? If it's something else, what is it? Let's define atheism. Again, I'm just going to be a broken record, but we're so close to having somewhat of a constructive conversation, and we're just missing it. But I think that guy's name was Brian. Brian did a good job.
How you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I guess since you said morality and purpose cannot be found in science, it would just depend on like what you're referencing. If you're saying a description of your psychological preferences would be considered within science, sure. But I don't think that you have to say that it comes from science in order to be like an atheist. As an agnostic atheist, I don't know if God exists and I don't believe that a God exists. And the only ones that I would really reject would be like the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, perfect notion of God that plenty of Christians like prescribe themselves. So I guess
how is that relevant to this claim?
You're basing a position of morality and purpose in some like notion of God that isn't the same type of notion of God that typical Christians would prescribe. Your notion of God is
what typical Christians?
Yeah, typically when I talk to Christians, they say that they believe in an all-knowing.
How about Cardinal Newman, who defined God as conscience? He's a major influence on all of Catholic social theory. How about that Christian?
Sure. So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
That's the circular definition. What do you mean
How
when
is
you
that
say
circular?
you believe?
How is that circular?
Because you added no content to the answer by substituting the word true and believe.
I said you think it to be true.
All right. So if
What's
you
a
believe
belief?
something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it. That's what I mean by that. It isn't something that you say. It isn't something that's associated with logical consistency. It's not declarative. It's not propositional. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's the presupposition of your attention and your action. And you're either fragmented, in which case you worship multiple gods, or there's some unity at the bottom of it that makes you an unstoppable force.
Okay, so you're saying that you don't believe something if you wouldn't die for it?
Not really, no.
Okay. So then,
How would you define belief? Something you say?
Can I explain? Like, I could believe it is the case that this pen exists, but if someone like threatened my life, right, I would lie in order to be able to save my life, right? Like, I think you would do that too. You wouldn't lie to save your
Don't
life?
be so sure.
You wouldn't lie to save your life?
How much do you know about me? I didn't lie to save my career. I didn't lie to save my clinical practice.
Would you lie to like save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
No, can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone?
Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
What the hell is going on? Again, if you're going to use terms like steeped in sin, then can we stop pretending you're not representing the Christian side? And what's funny is he's pushing back on this gentleman for saying what is typically true of Christian belief. And then he's saying, well, what about this Christian? He keeps going back to this cardinal. Yeah, influential, sure, to one kind of denomination within Christianity, by the way. It's a deflection, and so is this. He knows that he's talking about something as simple and arbitrary as a pen. That was the example for a reason, because you can believe in things. I can believe that my neighbor's car is red. I don't have to be willing to die for that belief to make it true that I believe that. And also, if we're going to use JP's lines, I could just say, I would never be put in a position where that would be the case. Just like he's trying to get out of answering the question by saying it wouldn't be the case. Like, the lack of consistency here is either truly bad faith, consciously so, or JP's mind is getting weak. Because that's so crystal clear. And do you see the animosity on his face? I don't understand this. Is it a tactic because someone's getting too close to poking the correct button? And by the way, keep in mind, where has this entire ridiculous conversation stemmed from? He asked if he believed in the all-knowing, all-powerful version of God, to which JP has to say, define believe. Think is true. Oh, you've added no content here. You must not know me. You don't know what belief is. It's to live. It's to die. Cool, man. Do you believe in it? I guarantee you, in a normal, everyday setting, if you ask Jordan Peterson, does he believe the Subway is over there? And he has bought Subway sandwiches from that Subway over there, and he can visually see at the time of the question the Subway sign over there. He's going to be like, yeah. He's not going to say, what do you mean by believe? If I would die for Subway, you must not know me. What? These aren't real answers, and they should be stopped immediately for such. But things are getting spicy. Let's see where it goes.
I'll give you an example. If you're like in like Nazi Germany, and it is the case that there's like Jewish people in your attic and you're trying to protect them,
example.
Would you lie to like the Nazis? If
I
they're
would have
asking?
done everything I bloody well could, so I wouldn't be in that situation
you
to begin
lie?
with. It's a hypothetical, and it's
You
not
can't answer
answerable.
hypotheticals?
No, I can't answer a hypothetical like
Why?
that because
Did
it's
you eat
far.
today?
Look,
Did you eat
don't
today?
play games.
I'm not playing a game. I'm just
Yes,
asking if
you
you ate
are.
it.
If you present me with an intractable moral choice that's stripped of context and you back me into a corner, you're playing game. I just told you
Hypothetical.
I would do everything that I could to make sure that I'm never in that situation. By the time you've got there, you've made so many mistakes that there's nothing you can do that isn't a sin.
Being born in Nazi Germany and trying to protect people that you care about, like there could be a Jewish friend that you have and you want to protect them.
I think you should
have
just
them in
give
your
up on
attic.
that line of questioning.
Give up on just like trying to clarify your position? Because
I
you don't
did
like, are you like
clarify.
uncomfortable with me asking this question? It's just a basic hypothetical. Like I could ask you.
It's just a
did you-
basic
yeah, yeah.
hypothetical
Like, you
where you
if
put Jews' lives at stake in Nazi Germany. That's just a basic hypothetical.
Obviously, you would lie in that scenario to save their life, but you're like not trying to answer this question for some reason.
I just told you why.
Are you anti-fascist?
I know I'm interrupting in this one a lot, and this guy's doing a pretty decent job, but it's his Not that he owes Jordan Peterson like a more level-headedness, but there's that slight twinge of sarcasm there that Jordan Peterson can't stand, and you shouldn't have to play to this. I'm saying that fully. But if you get this shot, and so many people are going to see this, I believe you can do better here. You can just say, hey, you don't have to like my hypothetical. Would you grant me for 1 minute the ability to articulate this thought experiment to you? I'm bringing up Nazi Germany because you just said that the only situations one would ever be in where they would be placed in this hypothetical is if they've already sinned so much, if they've already gone so far down the line that now they're trapped in this place where there's nothing good to do. And he's giving a very easy scenario where that is clearly wrong. You're growing up, you just happen to be born in this area at this time where this major atrocity happens through no fault of your own. Do you all of a sudden have a Jewish neighbor that you happen to care about that you're in a position to lie for? How unbelievably dishonest of Jordan Peterson to try to stop him from explaining and articulating further a response back to his point that immediately defeats it. That is beyond frustrating and unprofessional.
Like, so you're
Why
anti-fascist?
are you asking that?
I was just asking, just clarifying. But like, okay, again, you're not answering this hypothetical because you know it shows that you clearly would lie to save
I'm
someone's life.
answering it in
Obviously,
a
that's
manner
not what
you
truth
don't
is.
find acceptable.
Obviously, because I care about truth.
I wouldn't be in that scenario.
Obviously, right? Logically, because that's
No.
already happened. Like, that's in the past. You don't have a time travel device. We're bringing this logical hypothetical up to show you that in some circumstances that do happen within the real world, you would lie to save people's lives. So your definition of truth isn't actually how we're typically using it. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to muddy the waters when I ask you, like, do you believe this? Do you think this to be true? So you don't actually have to answer the questions. And plenty of Christians don't like that because they clearly see that you don't really like want to be associated with
I can
Christianity with that
imagine
respect.
that I was in a situation where the best I could do as a consequence of my previous mistakes was to tell the least amount of lie I could manage. But that would likely indicate that I had made all sorts of catastrophic errors on my way there.
So
Right.
you would lie to save someone's life. So again, you do believe it to be true in that circumstance, even though you like lied in that scenario. So
Not
clearly that's not
without
what
the
you see to be true.
context that I put it in.
You were not willing to
I
die for it.
said-
You were not willing to let other people die for it. So that's not what you see to be true then, seemingly.
You're doing exactly what I said you were doing at the beginning of the conversation. You're generating an impossible, restricted, hypothetical with no precursors to back me into a
How's it
corner.
possible? Is there something contradictory about it? Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. Yeah.
Well, that went nowhere. What is the point of coming on a show where you know you're going to be the one person and you get to choose the claims that you make if you're so unwilling to engage in the claims themselves? For someone who has a rule for life that is be precise with your language, this is so far from that. And that's not just me trying to do some little silly gotcha. Like, honestly, I believe that Jordan Peterson believes it's important to be precise with your speech, but his first two claims are so imprecise. And at no time did he firm them up. And unfortunately, most of the time, the atheists were not able to ask questions to get them firmed up. But this has been unbelievably unproductive. Like, I really wonder how everyone involved feels about this. Are they just generating content? Did they hope to achieve something? Did Jordan Peterson feel like he showed the lack of whatever that he perceives in atheists? Did atheists feel like they were able to get to adequately have a conversation with someone representing the Christian side or believing side? This just feels like a failure, but we're halfway through. Here we go.
My next claim is that everybody worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it.
Thank you.
Hi there.
I'm Zena. So I want to start off with like defining terms.
Yeah.
How do you define worship?
Prioritize.
Prioritize. So almost like having a preference over something rather than the
It's a
other.
hierarchy of preferences.
Yeah.
And you use it to direct your attention.
Right.
So whatever you're attending to, you're worshiping.
Good on her. We are defining things right off the bat. That's wonderful. I also think then if Jordan's definition of worship is true, we have no problem with that, right? Everyone has preferences. Everyone has a hierarchy of preferences or what they give their attention to. But what is loaded into the word worship, especially when it's atheist against a believer or Christian? Something much more than what you give your attention to. Again, if we're just going to pretend that words don't mean what they mean, what is the point of this conversation? Why do we have to have the second part? He's saying everybody, but of course he's talking to atheists. But is this true for him? No, he has it all figured out. He has it sorted. Believers have it sorted. They know what they worship and why. But those atheists who won't admit there's a God and then not worship him or give the proper attention to. They've replaced that with something else. Well, they've replaced a preference for what they give their attention to over a God they don't believe in, but that's not what this claim is actually saying or how it's used by believers against atheists. You know what I want? Jubilee, I volunteer to be like a moderator, at least for Christian versus atheist things, some kind of mediator where I can try to just wall in some of the conversation. I know that's not how it works, but okay.
So I've kind of become a little bit familiar with your idea of like this value-laden hierarchy,
Yeah.
right? And you kind of posit that at the bottom of this hierarchy, or you could call it top or bottom, I suppose. Right. At the bottom of this hierarchy, this foundational priority in your life is going to be considered God.
That's
is that
right.
correct?
Yes.
Right. I'm trying to imagine a situation in which could there be that someone has a priority at their foundation that is different from someone else's?
Oh, definitely.
Right. So we can have different conceptions of God.
That's why we fight.
Right. So essentially, there's not one God, but there are multiple gods, and these gods exist in some realm of truth. It's true that this person has one God and it exists.
Yeah, probably better to think about it as multiple values, but that there's a hierarchy of values with something at the bottom.
Right, but at the bottom is God, and
That's a definition, yeah.
Yeah, so at the bottom is God, and there can be multiple people with different conceptions of God, and they're each valid in being called God. So there are multiple gods that exist.
It depends on what you mean by valid. So far, so good, but it depends on what you mean by valid, because I would say that some foundational conceptions don't play out when they're implemented. So if you put the wrong thing at the foundation, you end up in hell, for example. That's what happens in totalitarian states.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying...
So they're not all equal. Like, all foundational principles are not equal, even though they might be equally foundational. Right.
So what makes one kind of foundational tenet like better than another one?
That's an excellent question. Iterability. Imagine that you play a game with someone and you're a kid, and it's fun. So then you play again and again and again.
So repetition.
It's playability across multiple iterations. So then you have a friend, and a friend is better than having a game. Right? So that's one. Breadth of application is another. So if it's just for me now, it's not as good as something that would be benefit to both of us across time.
Right. So we're explaining like characteristics that can be applied to like these types of like foundational values. But why is it that this iterability makes it better, and what does better mean?
Well, one hallmark of better is likely to be selected voluntarily.
Right.
So it's invitational.
Another descriptive kind of quality. So we're talking about characteristics that in some type of system with a goal, an output being like, we could maybe say happiness, right? Or some type of
harmony.
Harmony, right?
Yeah, that's better. Not happiness precisely, because it's too short term.
Exactly. So as someone who is an atheist, right, I can explain that within a system, there are things that we can see as better or worse to meet this goal or meet this output. But what we're interested in, though, is what could make these things, regardless of any system, right?
Well, imagine that you set up a system and you implement it, and it produces the opposite results to which you intend. Oh yeah, that's not a good system.
Exactly.
Right, so the foundational principles are lacking because when you implement them, the game degenerates instead of moving towards the aim.
Right,
Okay,
so we're talking about within a system. When we talk about something being moral, right, just absolutely moral, it means that without a system, right, this thing is simply moral with no reason. Like, stance independent, this thing is good. So I'm trying to figure out if such thing can exist. And if so, do you believe that these things are moral in of themselves, like self-evidently moral, or are they moral in accordance with the system?
I can't define them any more accurately than I already did, really.
Okay. In regards to morality, when we talk about the divine, when we talk about God and religion, these moral tenets and religion, right, and God exists as good because it is God, right? So it's self-evident, right? Without any kind of goal or output, this thing is good. So I want to figure out how...
There's an element of that that's true. So for example, in the story of Job, Job is unfairly tortured in consequence of a bet between God and Satan. And so Job is emblematic of someone who's being hurt for no apparent reason. Okay, so Job's response to that is that he refuses to lose faith in himself, and he refuses to lose faith in the ultimate goodness of being. Okay, and those are axiomatic decisions. They're not exactly evidence dependent because he is suffering. There's an arbitrariness in that's reminiscent of what you claim.
So I'm essentially trying to figure out, do you believe that something can be good, like stance independently, something that can be good.
I don't know what you mean by stance independent.
Okay, so
you
I
mean
mean-
independent of people?
Independent of people, we can use that, or more so, I want to be more specific. Something that can be good, right, regardless of any end goal. It's just good.
No, I think good is tied up with goal.
Goal, okay, I completely agree. So in a sense, this is why—
That's why the religious goal in Christianity is the establishment of the kingdom of heaven on earth. It's goal dependent.
Okay, right.
Or it's in reference to a goal.
So,
Or the goal would be the
but
imitation of Christ.
Someone's goal, right, can be something that doesn't encompass being in congruence with God or being with God.
No, the
that be
thing
true?
that they want to be in
Oh,
congruent.
right, okay,
Hang
it
on
is
a-
God.
That's right.
Sorry,
That's
I
right. That's
corrected
good. That's
myself.
great. The thing they want to be in congruence with is fundamentally equivalent to their God.
So what makes someone a Christian and what makes someone not a Christian? What makes, like that's what I'm trying to figure out, because—
That's a good question.
Yes.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
probably the deepest answer to that is willingness to shoulder your cross voluntarily and trudge uphill regardless of circumstances.
Well, not according to the Nicene Creed or any other workable definition of Christianity. Again, first of all, we're so far off from claim number 3. She went back a little bit to claim number 2. I am glad that they are enjoying the first somewhat mutual conversation so far, but it's just not fair to the conversation, to the setup, to the people who are going to be viewing this. And Christians, when will you reject Jordan Peterson, or are you just so happy to have anyone that is at all esteemed in any way somehow kind of embrace your religion? Surely you know that this is not the definition of Christianity. Metaphorically speaking, I bear my cross. I suffer to take care of my family. I sacrifice parts of myself, whether it's time or energy, to provide a way. Like, do you see how abstract and meaningless it becomes? Am I now a Christian? Would a Christian call me a Christian for bearing up my cross? No, of course not. Truly, what are we doing here?
So someone can have a God, because in your definition, your first preference, that is God, right? So someone can believe in God, right, and not be a Christian, right?
Yeah, well, there's a statement that Christ makes in the Gospels. He says, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven.
So not that they're even saying that they believe in God, but they just—
No, but that's why I'm saying this to you, is that Christ himself points out that there's a difference between people who say they believe and people who act it out. And the fundamental issue is the action rather than the stated belief.
But he also says that, to be saved, right, you must believe God has died for your sins, or that God has resurrected in some way. So it's like, I don't necessarily think that we can take from the Bible and say that, like, acting in accordance with God necessarily means, or acting in accordance with, the principles of God, like, for example, sacrifice, like you talk about, means that you are Christian. I don't see how you can get that from that interpretation and then, kind of justify it as the true
I don't
interpretation.
think that the fact that you sacrifice is sufficient to make you Christian.
So can we repeat once again what you believe makes someone Christian?
There's many things, but one of the most fundamental is that you believe that the cosmos itself is founded on the principle of voluntary self-sacrifice. Best founded. Let me offer you a contrary example. So I could assume that power rules. And so that my assumption would be, if I can make you do it, I win. Right, and I can found a whole society on that, and that happens a lot, by the way. And that's also how societies tend to degenerate. And so that would be a society that was founded on the principle that you get to sacrifice and I don't have to. Right, now the contrary to that would be something like, you give up voluntarily and with courage all the things you need to situate yourself properly in relationship to the future and other people. Right. So then there's a harmony. That's why I talked about harmony earlier.
So you navigate your life, right, in accordance kind of to this principle of self-sacrifice. Can I say it in that way?
Yes, you can definitely say it that way. That's exactly right. And navigate is the right term.
So someone does not have to have any awareness of Christ, of the story of Jesus, but let's say 60% of their actions, right, or more, whatever kind of metric you want to use, are in line with this self-sacrificial.
So the Christian thinkers of the Middle Ages dealt exactly with that problem when they were talking about the pre-Christian philosophers, for example. And they noted the similarity, let's say, between pre-Christian Greek thought and later Christian thought, and presumed that there were moral actors outside the Christian domain.
Right. So is that person Christian, though? Is that person Christian?
Well, to some degree, again, that's a matter of definition, because they wouldn't be proclaiming Christian propositions, but they're acting out the pattern. right? So,
Christianity.
yeah, so you imagine that full Christianity would involve a dozen things. And you can imagine someone who knows nothing of Christianity, say, acting out 8 of them.
Right.
Right.
So
then they'd be 8/12ths Christian or something like
8/12
that.
Christian.
Well,
but to be like a full Christian, how can someone say I am Christian? Like I am Christian, not 8/12, but Christian.
well,
don't understand.
I hesitate to do that personally because
Okay.
I think it's the kind of goal that you be very careful about proclaiming. The technical.
But belief is not necessarily, to be mostly Christian, belief is not necessary. 8/12s or, right?
Well, it depends on what you mean by belief. See, because I would say that acting out the pattern is the deepest form of belief. Now, you could add to that what you say. So, maybe in the optimal situation, how you act and what you imagine and what you say, they're the same, right? But you can imagine a hypocrite who says all sorts of wonderful things and does nothing, and you could imagine another person who acts in a very positive manner but proclaims nothing.
So what I'm kind of seeing is like a descriptive, a really comprehensive but descriptive analysis of human action, human thought, and by which we can characterize people and put people in boxes. But I don't see.
Why in boxes?
Like, when I say in boxes, I mean like I can categorize you based on your actions, not based on necessarily what you say, but based on your actions that you are more so or less so Christian, right? Things like that, right? So we can categorize people as Christian.
Well, I would say more or less voluntarily self-sacrificing.
But that's also what we came to, though, is that someone can be like 60% or 70% Christian based on simply just acting in that way.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins is like that.
I watched that debate.
Let's pause there. We've been voted out by the majority.
Very good.
Thank you so much.
Really, very thoughtful.
Again, I want to assume the best here, but I really don't like some of these ending statements. Again, it's him putting people all below him in these categories. This person is very thoughtful because she didn't really, at least not effectively, push back on his actual claims. They got to have the conversation that he likes, where he is in the lecture position and probing people to think about things in different ways and arrive at certain half conclusions that don't have to actually lead anywhere or pin him up against a wall. And so that person's very thoughtful, but the person who is giving a thought experiment to accurately represent their point is not someone to be taken seriously, and he can just shut down their argument. Like, again, I'm sad. I'm sad that this is the state of how this has to go. I don't know why even Jordan Peterson wouldn't be wanting to discuss the actual claims he came to make. And I guess, to be fair, it's not his job to keep these people on point, and she's the one that took it into the realm of morality, but he's happy to be there. And when someone is directly on point, like slavery on morality, then they're the person that he's not going to answer or shuts down defensively. That's very frustrating. Maybe the next conversation will actually be about the claim.
Hey, Dr. Peterson.
How are you doing?
Danny, nice to meet you.
What's your name?
Danny.
Danny.
You're saying atheists worship things or people or places, whatever. Can you be very clear about your definition of worship again?
Attend to, prioritize, and sacrifice for.
Okay, that's it. That's your understanding of worship.
Well, I could flesh it out, but that'll do for the time we have.
Okay. Do Catholics attend to Mary?
Yes.
Okay. So do they fit that description of worship?
Yes.
So you would say Catholics and other people that revere Mary, like the Eastern Orthodox tradition, worship Mary.
Well, they might not put her in the highest
But
place.
you would put it that way.
No.
You just said it. Now you're taking it back.
There's
now?
still a hierarchy.
Okay, there's a hierarchy, but within the
There's something at the top.
All right, you can worship things
Mary
below.
is quite a ways up the hierarchy, but not at the top.
Let's go over your definition of worship again. What's your definition of worship?
Attend to.
Attend to.
Prioritize.
Do
And
Catholics
sacrifice for.
What do Catholics attend to? Do they prioritize Mary over all other human beings?
No, I didn't say overall, did I? I didn't
Well,
add that to my definition.
You understand.
I said there was a hierarchy as well.
You attend to
So you can attend to something trivially, or you can attend to it deeply.
Okay, now you're adding stuff to the definition. But your original
I
definition.
added the hierarchy part at the beginning.
Are you
just
familiar?
didn't understand it.
Are you familiar with the Immaculate Conception?
Why is that relevant?
Because you go to a Catholic church, don't you? Or you've attended recently. You're interested in Catholicism, aren't you?
Sure.
All right. Are you familiar with their doctrines?
Somewhat.
Okay, you're
Their
familiar.
doctrines are very
how do they
deep.
regard Mary?
Why are you asking me that?
Because you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either you're a
'cause I
Christian
won't
or you're
talk
not.
to you if you're a smartass.
Either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression
private.
I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video.
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
I don't think bad behavior should beget bad behavior. And I don't know this atheist. I'm sure that he is as riled up as I am watching Jordan Peterson railroad people, not answer people, talk down to people, condescend, etc. You can't do it back, especially if you're trying to convey anything meaningful. He was on a decent track to trying to show that worship can fall short, or that the definitions of worship can get tricky, because within Christianity, the idea that one would worship anything other than God would be at least contentious in some areas. And so if we're going to roundabout get to how atheist or anybody else who's not a Christian, everybody worships something kind of conversation, maybe that's a good thing to articulate. But he was so quickly rude. Again, it doesn't matter if you're doing it to Jordan Peterson or not. He was obviously rude and short and not trying to hear Jordan Peterson's answers. That's my opinion. And when you do that to someone like Jordan Peterson, you are going to give them, in a sense, permission to weasel out. So is your goal to look cool on YouTube, to have the last word or a nice quip, or is it actually to help convey why Jordan Peterson's ideas are wrong and even harmful about atheism or what it is to be an atheist, etc.? Again, I can hear some of you say, no one owes this to Jordan Peterson to make the conversation go well. Sure, but they're there. He's the one person. He's the one who gets to make the claims. You're there. You've got a very short window. I think intention and goal here matters a little bit. And I think that this guy, he screwed himself, first of all. And second of all, he screwed the conversation or the potential for the conversation. And that sucks. But let's see what happens next.
Hi there.
Hi, nice to meet you.
What's your name?
Gerard.
Hello, Gerard.
Nice to meet you, sir. So you've said that worship is when you prioritize and sacrifice for something, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a hierarchy in there.
Sure. So I prioritize and sacrifice for my wife more than I would prioritize and sacrifice for a random person on the street, right?
Probably, yeah.
Presumably. Do I worship
I don't know.
my
I've
wife?
seen some pretty bad marriages.
Assuming a good marriage, are you saying I worship my wife?
I'm trying to define worship.
Well, that's what I'm asking. So prioritize and sacrifice. I do
the
those
higher
things.
it is in the hierarchy, the more what you're doing is akin to worship. But even in your trivial acts of attention, you're prioritizing and partaking in worship, even if you don't know it.
So I am
And it's
prioritizing.
partly, well, with regard to your wife, say. So why do you value your wife? You do value your
Yes,
wife.
I love
okay.
her. So I
Right.
prioritize and I
Okay.
sacrifice for her.
Right. So that's within the confines of love, let's say.
Sure.
What else does it serve?
What else does what serve?
Your love in your marriage?
I am married to my wife because I love her. That's
Yeah.
also why I prioritize and sacrifice for her. I certainly wouldn't think I worship her, and I don't think anyone else would make that.
I'm
Are you
trying to
making
make
that
a
claim?
definition.
To be fair here, and this is why it's more important to talk about the semantic use of the word worship in belief versus non-belief, because Jordan Peterson is being pretty careful with his words here. He's not defining worship as anything that gets attention. He's saying within the concept of worship, there is a hierarchy of preferences and attention and sacrifice. And so just because you give something attention or prioritize it does not necessarily equate worship. I think he's actually made that clear, and it's moved the conversation forward, or has the potential to. But then just like defining God as conscience, we're losing what we mean when we talk about these things. And so again, I think the best thing an atheist can do is just say, stop. Like, obviously we're all trying to make the same point. I don't worship X just because I paid attention. It sounds, Jordan, like maybe that's not actually what you're saying. When you hear some Christians say, I worship the true God and God alone, and that's the only thing I worship, or the only thing that's worthy of actually being worshiped would be the perfect creator of love and justice, right? That seems to be the kind of worship that is within belief. And so when you, in the context of belief versus non-belief, say everybody worships something, I think you're making a false equivalency, and I want to discuss that with you. But again, it's just like, it's such an impossible conversation the way that it's structured.
There's a hierarchy of attentional priority, and as you move up it or down it, depending on whether you think about it as a pinnacle or a foundation, you move more towards worship. Right, so even the small things, I'll give you an example. Imagine you go on a date. Well, imagine that your aim is a long-term relationship like a marriage. Okay, now imagine that your aim is short-term sexual gratification. Your pattern of attention is going to vary during the date, depend on your ultimate end. That's the hierarchy. The way that you attend to your wife is dependent on your ultimate aims, even if you don't know it.
So at what point is it worship? Because it sounds like you're saying
It's
worship is almost a spectrum, right? Or it's not a binary, it's not a
It's kind of like, that's a good question.
When
It's
when is it worship as opposed to just I love my wife?
the closer you get to the top or the bottom, the more it's more like
How
worship.
close to the top? Because I don't think I worship anything. And if you're saying I have to hit a certain threshold for it to be worship, it is possible I don't worship anything then, right?
It's not possible that you don't worship anything.
What do I worship?
Because you wouldn't attend. Well, love.
So you think I
apparently.
worship love?
Do you attend in consequence of love?
I
See,
do.
I'm trying to define something. What
Right.
do you mean worship?
Well,
I told you what I meant. What do you mean?
So I mean, something you worship is something that you have a reverential view for in a manner in which you believe it to be above and beyond normal things you like. Like you
So do
presumably
you have
worship
that
God.
attitude towards your wife?
I have that
Do you
attitude.
privilege her compared to other women?
Of course I privilege her compared to
Okay.
other women, but I don't worship her. Nor
Well-
does she worship me.
By the definition you just offered, yes, you do.
This is so unbelievably frustrating. Let's just try it on with a different word. Let's use another religious word like baptism. Now, most people, again, if you're having a normal conversation with someone who's not Jordan Peterson, we know that baptism is actually not everyone can agree, but let's go with the symbolic act of going under the water, being made anew, coming out a new creation, a symbolism of your devotion and your new life in Jesus. And again, Christians are going to argue with that because none of you agree. But insofar as that's a much better definition of baptism than abstractly what we're getting here with worship tied to a religious definition, what if I then, playing Jordan Peterson, said, you know what, I know baptism is thought of typically just within Christianity. Actually, I'm already doing more work than JP does. Baptism is actually any time that a symbolic gesture is made by way of fluid or water or submergence with the expectation to arrive at a new surface. Think of this as like a tapestry of a hierarchy. When you emerge, you're doing what we all do evolutionarily speaking. You are coming forth from what was before, from chaos into order, and you see the light when you emerge as opposed to the darkness of the depth. And so, anyone that has made a transformation inwardly that is substantial enough over the course of time is actually going through a ritual of baptism. And so even though people don't believe in God or Christianity, I actually believe all atheists believe in baptism and have the potential to be baptized when they go through an inner condition change of this nature. Do you see how ridiculous it would be to try to put someone on the other end of me who understands the Christian definition and conception of baptism, and for me to tell them, or someone who doesn't believe in Christianity rather, that no, you're wrong about your understanding because I'm just defining this. You can go ahead and define it, but I'm putting this term out there in the context of belief and unbelief. It's utter insanity. And again, it should just be made as clear to him. Why are you playing games? Let's just call it whatever gets your most attention is your hierarchical preference. You trying to categorize that as a loaded spiritual term, worship, is where everything is going wrong. And you shouldn't be doing it, and you know why you're doing it. And let's talk about that. By the way, I literally did not plan to do the baptism thing. I don't want you to be impressed with it. That's how easy it is to do what Jordan Peterson does. And if you thought it profound at any level, that is exactly why Jordan Peterson has millions of people who think he's brilliant. He's not saying anything when he does that. I think he has actually said some really beneficial things. When he does that, he's saying nothing. What I just said is nothing. But anyways, let's continue.
Because you just offered a definition that involved prioritization and elevation.
Well, and thinking that she is divine above and beyond what a normal natural
Other women.
phenomenon can be. Not other women, no, beyond any human being could ever be. I will prioritize her over
See,
any
you're
other
making
human, but I
the
don't think
assumption.
that she is some
You're making
supernatural
the
being.
assumption that only the thing at the top or the bottom has anything to do with worship. And I'm saying that's not true. It's a hierarchy of prioritization. And there's either something at the top or the bottom, depending on the metaphor, or you're fragmented and confused. Those are the only options.
So let's say
you're either going in many directions,
okay,
or you're going in one direction.
so let's suppose I'm fragmented and confused. Then you agree I don't worship anything.
No, then you'd worship multiple things.
So what's the threshold when it's worship, right? I prioritize a lot of stuff.
I said that the closer you get to the pinnacle, or the
How
closer
close?
you get...
Can you give me some sort of metric? How close do I got to get to this pinnacle?
Do you know the difference between cheap literature and deep literature?
Yes.
Okay, that's the same issue. And how do you distinguish between them? What's the difference between cheap and deep?
I mean, it's really an opinion-based thing, right?
Is
I mean,
it? So it's just an opinion that
plenty of-
Dostoevsky is better than a porno magazine.
Well, I've spoken to people who think To Kill a Mockingbird's cheap. It's one of my favorite books. So, I mean, people will differ on
Well,
opinion.
just because people are stupid about things doesn't mean that their opinion is valid.
That's certainly true. I agree with that.
Okay, well, do you think there is a hierarchy in literary quality?
I think that there is a hierarchy to an extent in literary quality, but I think once you get to a certain threshold, it is just opinion. Like, I agree. Dostoevsky is better than a porno mag, but is F. Scott Fitzgerald better than Ernest Hemingway? I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. Why do you think that?
Because of what a book is, what literature is. Dostoevsky, he follows what literature is the purpose of more than the porno magazine
Okay,
does.
good. Well,
So it's about purpose and definitions.
Yeah, sure. Let me give you an analog then. Okay. The depth of worship is analogous to depth of literary significance. And the closer you get to what's deep, the more religious and worshipful your practice.
So
and maybe you don't know what's at the bottom, but something needs to be, or you're confused.
Well, so to use your analogy then, how deep do I have to go for it to be worship? Do I have to be Catcher in the Rye? Do I have to be War and Peace? Or
it depends on what you're seeking for.
I'm seeking to know whether I worship something. You've claimed I worship something, and I want to know.
If you want to have a deep and meaningful life, then you have to go all the way to the bottom or the top. And insofar as you're capable of doing that, because otherwise you'll be fragmented and miserable and anxiety-ridden and hopeless.
So I have to worship something to have a meaningful life. And
There's no difference between those two things.
Okay.
They're the same thing.
So if I don't worship anything, my life will not be meaningful, correct?
Well, that's the definition of nihilism.
Okay. So if I'm a nihilist, I don't worship anything.
That's true. And then you...
okay. Mm-hmm. You just said everybody worships something. I think you just agreed there is a class of people that doesn't.
Well, they're incoherent in their worship. And hand gestures like that aren't going to help.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Look, if you're incoherent and fragmented and aimless, which is what happens if your objects of worship are unstructured and chaotic, then you're going to be anxiety-ridden and without hope. That happens. That's a technical argument.
But there's happy nihilists.
Oh,
How do you explain that there are happy nihilists then? Because
well,
you just said they
the
can't
mere
be.
fact that you state that there are happy nihilists doesn't make it true. Like, what's your evidence that, how do you measure nihilism and how have you associated it with happiness? And what's your definition of happiness? And have you compared them to religious people? Because if you do, by the way, it's clearly the case that religious people over the long run have better mental health. It's a well-documented fact in psychological literature.
Sure.
So your claim is just a claim. It doesn't stand on anything.
So you disagree with the claim that there exists even one happy nihilist?
I didn't say that.
Okay, would you agree there exists at least one happy nihilist in the universe?
It's not a question that has any meaning as far as I'm concerned, because it depends on what you mean by happy, and it depends on the duration that you're trying to calculate over. Now and then there's probably some deluded soul who thinks he's a nihilist who's momentarily pleased with himself. But as a long-term strategy to deal with the future, to get along with yourself and with others, it's sadly lacking. That's why Nietzsche warned that when God died, as he announced in 1850, that people would be flooded with pointless, anxiety-ridden, hopeless nihilism. And that was what would attract them to, for example, to the false gods of totalitarianism, which is exactly what happened, because everybody worships something, even atheists who think they don't.
Aren't there unhappy Christians or devoted believers? So worshiping something is neither sufficient nor necessary for happiness then?
Well, terrible things can come your way regardless, and that does happen, but it's the case that even when circumstances become deeply troublesome, that how you're oriented makes a big difference. So I'll give you an example. So the book of Job deals with the issue of unfair suffering. So Job is a good man who has everything taken away from him in the most painful possible way.
To settle a bet, right?
With Satan, yes. And so he makes the axiomatic presumption that he won't lose faith in himself or in the spirit of being itself. And that helps him remain calm and forward-looking through his time of trial.
Doesn't he absolutely curse God?
No. His wife tells him to do that.
Okay, this guy did, I mean, in terms of what the goal here should be, staying on topic, pushing back, getting Jordan Peterson to be consistent, this guy did much better, I think, than most people have. At least we're talking about worship. At least we're directly dealing with the claim, even if Jordan Peterson didn't like it and weaseled out. If your claim is that everybody worships something, and then you say there's a whole group of people that by definition aren't worshiping something, nihilist, then you have defeated yourself. I know he doesn't like that it looked like a gotcha moment, and I wish it could have presented itself in a more higher fashion to meet his criteria of how he should be defeated, but it is clear that when pressed, Jordan Peterson here is not able to be consistent with what he is putting forward, especially when you start using things. This is what's amazing. It was Jordan first. You can go back and look, who associated happiness with worship. And then he goes on to say how unhappy people are those that have fragmented worship, or he would later say don't worship at all. But when this gentleman points out correctly that there are plenty of unhappy Christians or believers who do worship or believe in worship, that barrier is not necessary, to which Jordan Peterson says, well, you'd have to define happiness. Like, you were the one using it. You know what you mean. I really believe no one can beat Jordan Peterson. And the interesting thing is that is in no way a sign of Jordan Peterson's ability. It's a sign of his disability. Like, I wonder if Jordan thinks there's any conceivable way he can lose, or that something he said can be falsified. I just don't understand how he's not called out on this more. Like, every single time he gets a question he doesn't like, he says why he doesn't have to answer it, or he says first you would have to define this, this, and that. But he expects every single question he asked to be answered, and he is the one loading all kinds of terms in there and smuggling plenty in along with it without defining it for them. He used nihilist, he used happiness, but when the other guy does, he all of a sudden has the burden of proof here. It's so unbelievably disingenuous.
My final claim is that atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories. Hi there.
It's very nice to meet you.
What's your name?
I'm Ian.
Hi, Ian.
Yes. So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you can beat them with a rod too. He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
No.
So then God doesn't fit within Christian ethics.
Well, the biblical library is a continuing story, and everything written in it has to be contextualized by the entire text. There's 65,000 hyperlinks in the biblical text. And you can take pieces of it out of context and criticize them, and that's what you're doing. But that's a mistake, I think. It's an analytic mistake, because you're putting the cart before the horse.
I really don't think so. I think that if we say that something is Christian ethics, then I think that all of the books essential to Christianity would fit with it, especially if it's like the main character. When we're talking about
How do you deal with
God,
the morality of war?
So
how do you think you should deal with the morality of war?
Sure. Because I feel like the morality, like I feel like Christian ethics, like this is kind of, I guess I just think it's like kind of an absurdity to say that God doesn't fit within Christian ethics, but sure, well, we can go on my ethics. That's totally fine.
I don't know what you mean by an absurdity. What game are you playing with that
Well, I just
question?
think that it's an absurdity to say that the Christian God doesn't fit within Christian ethics, that like the Christian God isn't like Christian ethical.
I said that the specific statements that you made don't take the context of the stories into account, and so that your analytical approach is faulty.
Sure.
Don't put words in my mouth.
Sure, then let's go through the
Thank you.
example. Yeah, so, and I apologize. So let's go through the example. So in 1 Samuel 15:3, God says, go and slaughter the Amalekites, slaughter the men, the women, the children, the infants. What's the justification for that? Is that in line with Christian ethics?
That's a good question. I don't really know what to do with the terrible, blood-soaked, saturated history of the human past. I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. I mean, what you try to do in your own life, as far as I can tell, is to conduct yourself in a manner that makes such things much more unlikely.
I totally agree.
We're all saddled with the problem of the catastrophes that got us here, aren't we?
Yeah, but this one was commanded by God. That's the problem.
Yeah,
That's what differentiates it from anything else, is that this one, it's God saying, go and do this atrocity.
Do you think that there's ever such a thing as a righteous war?
I'm skeptical. I'm not sure. It would probably be situational.
Well, right, fair
Yeah,
enough.
but this one
people...
certainly wasn't a just war. The context for the Amalekite slaughter is that 400 years earlier, they fought one battle, which they lost, and God says, that's it, I'm going to wipe them off the face of the goddamn earth. And then 400 years later, he commands the Israelites to genocide their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. That's not a just war at all. And also, a genocide is not a war.
Well, a genocide can be a war, but...
Absolutely not.
Look,
the genociding of the Amalekites, the men, the women, and the infants, that's not a war. The infants aren't combatants.
Look, I already said that it's very difficult to look at the blood-soaked past and to know exactly what to do about it. The answer I gave to the gentleman who is sitting here before you is that it's necessary to read a text like the Bible at all of its levels of analysis simultaneously. And there's a directional morality that emerges across time that has its roots in the Old Testament, for example, with its restrictions against murder specifically, that makes itself manifest in the Christian texts as the insistence on voluntary self-sacrifice as the foundational belief. That's a profoundly anti-violence ethos.
Do you have the belief in your theology?
Well, what do you think of that? Wait a sec. Now, redress what I just said.
So I'm about to address it, but I'm addressing it with a question. Do you think that God is by his very essence perfect?
You'll have to provide more.
Sure, just like maximally great and all like the
I think it's a
great making
definition.
qualities.
Sure.
Yeah,
By
like flawless. Yeah. So,
okay,
so does a flawless thing change? Does a flawless thing reveal like more and better information over time, or would a flawless thing say, here's what's good, here is the absolute good thing to do at all circumstances in time?
Well, we know some of that.
Wait,
Tell
so
the truth. That's one.
That's totally fine, but presumably...
No. You don't get to skate over that with that's totally fine.
It's a straw man of my position. It's a straw man of the argument. So
In what
the
way?
argument is that God...
Wait a sec. You said find
one...
one maxim that's transcendent across situations.
I didn't say any of those words. I'm not sure what conversation you're a part of.
Don't be a smartass.
I'm sorry.
Seriously. I mean it. If we're going to have a serious conversation, conduct yourself properly. Okay.
If you don't want someone to be a smartass, you can't have been a smartass to the 9 people that came before them, or some of them. Here.
Your aim was off then, obviously.
Well, not obviously.
When
we look at the Bible...
I said I didn't say the. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's formulated accurately. I'm not retreating at all. I'm advancing, sir. You are retreating.
Yes.
What's your point? Like, you're not making an argument. Don't be so sure. How much do you know about me? Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that. Look. Don't play games. I think you should just give up on that line of questioning. It's just a basic hypothetical where you put Jews' lives at stake in Nazi Germany. You're really quite something. Is it? So it's just an opinion that Dostoevsky is better than a porno magazine.
There are certain things I don't critique because I know I'm guilty of them. And until I can not be guilty of them, I'm not going to hold others to that standard. This is very simple. I'm actually surprised at how weak Jordan Peterson is appearing here. You have the upper hand. These people only get a couple minutes with you. You're the constant voice in the room. You're the one who got to make the claims. There is a power dynamic here. You don't have to like that he's swearing, and you don't have to like that he's a bit sarcastic, but you're not helping to make the conversation any more productive by having this righteous dad tone with this young man that you don't appreciate. You know what would be productive in moving the conversation forward is if you could answer these questions in the way that they are put, or respond to his statements in the way that they are made. You just put words in his mouth. I thought you didn't like that being done. He's not talking about the blood-soaked history of the past. He's talking about a particular battle that comes from the particular book in question, from the particular God that Jordan Peterson is alluding to being the arbiter of morality. So you don't just get to retreat, which is 100% what he's doing to. I don't know what to do with the blood-soaked past. All we can do is try to move forward. And don't you think it's interesting that eventually Christianity gets to a place of self-sacrifice and not genocide? Yeah, that is interesting, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the immutability of a perfect God. If you're going to claim that this God has anything to do with some set of ethics or morality, especially if they're going to be claimed to be objective, then we need to contend with the fact that we can show that they have not always been the same, which means, by definition, they are not objective, and that horrible things were done by this God and in the name of this God and via the command of this God, that then we don't get to just erase when we focus on the pretty parts that you think make up today's Judeo-Christian West values. Like, it's very simple. I actually think the best thing you can do with Jordan Peterson, and I hope someday I get to talk to him, is just slow way down and just keep returning to your very singular point and rephrasing it and reframing it as much as it takes to be able to get a direct answer, because otherwise you can and will be railroaded.
Rephrase your question because I must have missed it. I tried to answer it.
So in my mind, I guess by my lights, a perfect being doesn't change. A perfect being, if they're maximally good, maximally moral.
Does our understanding of the perfect being change?
Our understanding might, but
Okay,
presumably what the perfect being is revealing.
Well, I agree. How do we distinguish between that, though, at the human level?
How do we distinguish between whether...
Between our transforming understanding of perfection and perfection itself.
Between our...
We can only see through our own lenses.
Presumably a perfect being would be revealing all of these aspects all the time, especially if God's outside of time. I don't know how a God who's outside of time is revealing different things at different times. That just seems like incoherent to me.
Imagine something that's perfect.
Sure.
And complete.
Sure.
Okay, and it's trying to communicate with creatures who are anything but that.
Sure.
Well, they're going to get it wrong.
Sure.
Okay, now wait a sec. Do you blame that on the interpreters or the phenomena itself? For example, are you perfect in attending to your conscience?
Hold on. At the point in time when God is literally the one who created us, he could have created us in a way where we would always be receptive to these principles, where we don't have to go across like a learning curve where, maybe we'll understand like
free will.
thousands of years into the future, maybe we'll do it. Oh, also, if you believe in an all-knowing God, then free will is impossible because
wait a sec. Let's not go to that
because
yet.
you threw free will into the mix.
Well, that was the answer to your question.
Yeah, and
you said, why wouldn't God... Well,
it's
1,000 years of deep thinking philosophers would disagree with you. But
and 1,000 years of, or at least like the last 50 years of philosophers would disagree with you. These analytic philosophers, people like Graham Oppie make arguments about the incompatibility of omniscience and free will, that if God created this world, if he chose this world instead of that world, then he makes it causally inevitable every single action that you were going to make. If he made a world where we were just electrons in love, then none of this would have happened. But by making us in this world, knowing exactly what's going to happen in the future, it makes all of those events inevitable, which means that they're all causally determined, which means that we have no free will if you believe in an all-good God or an all-knowing God that made everything.
Well, have it your way.
Okay, cool. So then the free will theodicy fails.
Well, it fails for you. That doesn't mean you've disproved it. I mean,
Do you want to
tried
respond
to make
the argument?
Yes, you tried to make a case for a causally deterministic universe. I don't think there's any evidence for that at all.
Do you think that God could have created a different universe than the one that he created?
I have no idea.
Okay, so then there's going to be a double bind, right? So either he couldn't have done it, in which case he lacks a power, or he could have done it, in which case we don't have free will, because he chose this world instead of that world, making the events of this world instead of that world inevitable with his infallible knowledge.
I don't understand where you're headed.
It just means that the free will defense fails. Like all this, under your view,
if you want to have it fail, no problem. I don't know why it's relevant to the issue we're discussing.
Do you acknowledge that under your view, free will doesn't exist?
No.
Oh, then do you want to respond to the argument?
You'll have to phrase it more clearly so that someone like me can understand it.
Yeah, gotcha. So God already knows in advance everything that's going to happen, which means that by making this world instead of that world, everything is inevitable, which means that God's act of causing this world instead of that world...
Inevitable doesn't mean determined.
It's causally inevitable if God chooses this world instead of that world.
Doesn't make it determined.
Causally inevitable means determined.
No, it doesn't.
Absolutely, yes, it does.
Well, have it your way.
Okay.
That's not the case.
It's hard to know what to do with that. I understand where it went down the tracks that it went. Jordan Peterson is using free will as the excuse for the problem of evil or suffering, essentially. So then to properly talk about why the problem of evil resonates within a conversation of morality, you now have to explain why the free will defense fails. And if you open the can of worms that there is no free will with someone like Jordan Peterson, like no matter what this guy said, it was just never going to arrive, which again, I get why it happened, but then let's just drop free will. Let's just talk about not our perception of God, but the commands of God that we can see clearly, which is sometimes for his chosen people, don't do this, but then for the nations around them, okay, do this, which means that we don't receive the objective set of morals from this God. Like if you have 3 hours with him, talk about free will. If you have 3 minutes with him on the claim of morality, talk about morality. But this is what Jordan does. He will bring something up that he knows you must contend with to get to your final destination without having the time there, and he will just play ignorant. Oh, I don't know. I don't agree with that. I don't know. You say that. I don't. Like, what's the goal here? That's what I keep returning to.
What's your name?
I'm Liam.
Hi, Liam. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad. I'm surrounded by atheists.
My question to you, let me scoot in, would be, what does it mean to accept Christian values precisely, or Christian morality?
It means to aim up as hard as you can, no matter what happens to you.
Okay.
Okay.
So I think that that's a very broad definition of what Christian morality is.
Yeah, but it'll come in handy at some point in your life.
Right. But I think that many different disciplines and theologies.
Well, you asked for a truncated answer. Eh?
Right.
I mean, there's other ways of representing the situation, but I wanted to give you something that was kind of foundational briefly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It doesn't mean it's, exhaustive.
Yeah.
I could say that you would have to believe that Christ is God and he died for your sins, right? But that's in a very difficult way to understand. That's the same claim.
Yeah. If there are other theologies and disciplines that have similar types of values, how then is that definition mean? Wouldn't those also be Christian values under your definition?
That's a good question. I spent a lot of time studying different religious systems from all over the world and found multiple interesting layers of concordance.
Right.
So, for example, in ancient Egypt, their god Horus, who was the reviving god of the totalitarian state, the corrupt he was the god of attention. Right, and the Jews hypothetically came out of Egypt, and there was crosstalk between Egyptian and Jewish foundational morality, and then that bled into Christianity. I mean, human beings all over the world have come up with moral systems that fit roughly into a pattern, and they're very usefully studied. I learned a lot about Christianity by studying Taoism, for example, a lot. So I think you can make a case that Christianity formalized the landscape of good and evil more comprehensively and in more detail than any other religious system, and I think that that's part of the reason that it defeated paganism and spread so broadly across the West and is still dominant, still understructures our culture, for example.
The way you feel about Horus or Taoism or something is how I feel about Christian morals, I think.
Yeah, but how do I feel about them?
Well, that you took inspiration from them, you learned from them. Maybe
that's a good start,
right.
Because I would say that actually constitutes belief. Like you said, well, look.
Right.
In Noah, in the story of Noah, right? Noah is inspired by the apprehension that all hell is going to break loose. Okay, he regards that inspiration as God.
Okay,
right. And when God comes to Abraham, he comes to Abraham as the spirit of adventure. It's inspiration. One of the definitions of God in the Old Testament, unsurprisingly, given the derivation of the word, is inspiration.
Like I said, he will use other definitions of God when it suits his current talking point. I thought before God is conscience, now God is inspiration. If I said that to his face, he'd probably say, oh, well, they're one of the same. But no, they're not. They're distinctly different, and they have different meanings and applications. And also, they could work together, or they could absolutely fight each other. And it's also not the only definitions that you would talk about. And I'm sure if pressed, you would say you do not believe in Horus to the extent that you believe in Yahweh. So when this poor guy finally speaks after being respectful and listening and all the things that Jordan Peterson has said is a prerequisite to having a good conversation, and he begins with, well, then I feel the way about Yahweh that you feel about these gods. Jordan Peterson knows what he means, but he can't help himself from, well, what do I mean? And even when he gets a sufficient answer, you drew inspiration. I'm literally repeating back to you what you just said to me. Well, I think that's belief. No, you don't. And if you do, then you believe in everything, which equals believing in nothing, because they're mutually exclusive claims, and you know that if you've studied all religions. You cannot simultaneously say that you 100% believe. Remember, to believe is to live and die for in Christianity and Taoism and Horus. You simply cannot. So instead of playing those games, understand what he's trying to say and let him say it.
And so if you take inspiration from Christian ideas, then insofar as you do that, you are in fact a believer, which was my point with regards to atheists.
Correct.
Not understanding.
But have
what
you
they're
taken
projecting.
inspiration from Taoism or from studying Egyptian mythology?
Definitely.
So then you believe them under that definition?
Yeah, but I've incorporated them into something I think that's more comprehensive.
Is it possible to take inspiration and to appreciate the teachings without being a believer in their truth claims?
It depends. No, I don't think so. But I think you see, there are different kinds of truth claims, right? There's propositional truth claims, which are the truth claims of what you say. And then there's embodied truth claims, which is the truth claims of what you do. That should be prioritized. Optimally, what you say and what you do would be brought into harmony. But I would say if you had to prioritize, it should be what you attend to and what you act first. And that's what Christ actually says in the Gospels, because he points to the Pharisees, for example, who say all the right things, but don't do any of the right things, and points out very clearly that that's not acceptable.
I don't know that the Christian morality, those principles originate in Christianity, because you brought up other things that predate Christianity that you can very closely tie connections to.
Well, I don't think they do originate precisely. I mean,
Right.
I don't think the Christian claim is exactly that they originate in Christianity.
So if I'm
right?
living those values, how is it that I'm living the Christian values and maybe not the Egyptian values or something else?
Well,
Pause there. You've been voted out by
that was good. That was good. Yeah.
Damn, that was actually a really great question. I hate that he got robbed of it. Because again, this is, despite Jordan Peterson's wishy-washiness, he is making the claim here for Christianity. It's right there in the title. Atheists accept Christian morality, but deny its foundational story. So how perfect is the example of Jordan Peterson accepting Egyptian morality, but denying its foundational story? Again, I'm sure he would not say Horus was a literal person. He might say he embodies the metaphysical conjuring of the general idea of the act against willful blindness or something like that. But in reality, clearly this is an excellent point. And I hope that the people watching were able to distinguish that. I like this guy.
How you doing?
I'm good, how are you?
Good. What's your name?
I'm Kumari. So I was curious about this Christian morality that you're talking about, because a lot of my issues with Christianity have to do with the base morality of it, specifically with the idea of the rapture and how we see people that aren't going to come up with us with the rapture, and that concept of heaven and hell. I don't really agree with that morality, but if you could explain that to me and how I do agree with that, I would love to hear.
Well, I can't explain the rapture to you because that isn't something I concern myself with, and that's more of a sectarian belief than something that's central to Christianity. Now, there's all sorts of evangelical Protestants who might disagree with that, but that doesn't have anything to do with me. You asked a deeper question with regard to, let's say, heaven and hell and judgment. Yeah. Well, that's a tough one, right? I mean, sin, you could put it this way, sin is what puts you in hell. Right, and so then you might ask, well, how do you know you're in hell? How about you do anything to get out of it?
Can I ask you
How
a
about
question?
you know that you put yourself there?
Do you think, is sin a part of Christian morality?
What do you mean exactly? Sin as a part?
The
it's
concept
missing the
of sin?
Okay, it's derived from an archery term, and it means to miss the target. Right, and so it presumes that there's such a thing as a central target and that you can miss it in many ways, and the consequence of that will be your life will be ridden with anxiety, your life will be pointless, people will turn against you.
Don't believe in sin at all?
Well, do you believe in error? Have you made any mistakes?
What if I believe that the mistakes that you make, that they're fixable, and so that no sin is finite, and that the
that's a Christian belief.
The idea of hell, I don't believe in it.
That's also a Christian belief, by the way.
A Christian belief is hell?
No, that there's no sin that, well, there's one. The sin against the Holy Ghost is unforgivable, but that's really the sin against the process that would enable you to learn.
Okay. But there's a Christian belief that hell does exist, and if I commit sin, I'm going to go there, correct?
Yes.
So what if I don't believe in that? I think can I explain a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. I think that when you commit sin, that it's because of a lot of environmental factors in your life, like where you were born and who you were raised by. And so there are certain things that lead you down a dangerous path. And once you are dead, I think you're kind of removed of that person. There's no there are no factors of the earth that have to.
What happens after death.
Right.
So I would ask you, in these times that you've suffered terribly in ways that you thought would never end, do you believe that you had any causal role in that? Did you play a part in that?
In my own suffering?
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes I would say that there was a part that I played in that.
Okay,
but
that's the thing to find out.
I think that maybe it's a concept of free will that I don't really believe in, somewhat of free will, that I think that there are certain things in your life that lead you to do certain behaviors. And so when you commit those sins, you go to hell. I'm not too sure why you would still be reaping the consequences of that.
Like I said, I can't address that. Do you believe that you can change?
I do.
Do you believe you can change for the better?
I do.
Do you believe that when you change for the better, you abandon the things you've done in the past that weren't good?
I think that you can.
Okay. Then that's very much in keeping with Christian doctrine.
Can you explain to me how that's in keeping with Christian doctrine?
You believe
if you would go to hell for those things?
You believe you can improve.
Yeah.
Right? And you believe that if you improved, you would let go of things that were impeding you. That's a sacrifice. You believe that improvement would be upward, and you believe that you have agency in that. Yeah. Those are all Christian presuppositions.
Those are all presuppositions to so many different kinds of religious and non-religious, just straight up philosophical claims about betterment, about the concept of suffering or the alleviation of it. This is the entire problem, is you have someone that refuses to admit that they're a Christian, who won't make the final claims about the afterlife, even though he's literally talking about hell here. He will retract and say, well, I wasn't supposed to talk about what happens when you die. Like, that is actually what we're talking about, the morality of sin and hell. If he can just move away from these things whenever he wants, get a new Christian, Jubilee. This would have been so much, put Wes Huff in this very seat, and at least the conversations will be consistent within the Christian narrative. You can't, on one hand, argue so many things that are not Christian while saying that Christian morality is what atheists actually accept. And it makes the conversation truly impossible, as we're witnessing. Hey there, cutting in, it's me. It's late Monday night. I'm editing for tomorrow's release, and I realized the last few clips we were so close, the microphone completely cut out, but I'm not going to redo it. Honestly, you saw the vast majority of the conversation. Thank you if you made it this far. Please, if you have not, subscribe, like, share, comment, do all the things to help me here. I know a lot of people are going to make reaction videos from the Christian side, just completely bashing all of these atheists. A lot of people who probably hate Jordan Peterson are just going to talk about what a buffoon he was. And I know that I made some serious critiques, but I think that they were all grounded. Please let me know if you disagree. Again, I had the chance to be on this one, so it was just really thinking for me, like, what would I have said? What would I have done? What would have been the best thing to do in this situation? As almost preparation for myself for future endeavors. And so this was a bit of a thought experiment all the way through for myself. Anyways, thanks for being a part of it. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you Thursday with a new Thinking Thursday episode. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kaboga, Matthew, Perry, Sean, and Steve; my Humanist Heroes, Craig, James, Jared, Christy, and Matthew; my Atheist Advocates, Adquitar, Caleb, Dan, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas; as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.